The unfolding cataclysm of World War II. On a grey morning in September 1939, a generation that had sworn never again watched in horror as history began to repeat itself. The air raid sirens wailed over Warsaw, their haunting cry marking humanity's descent into its greatest trial. World War II was about to begin, not with a single shot, but with an avalanche of steel and fire that would reshape our world forever. This is the story of how civilization itself hung by a thread. It is a tale of how ordinary men became heroes, democracies transformed into arsenals, and scientists unlocked the very power of the sun. It is also the dark chronicle of how mankind's most sophisticated culture produced systematic barbarism, and how the most powerful nations on Earth found themselves fighting for their very survival. The numbers still stagger the imagination. 70 million dead, 6 continents ablaze, 1,000 years of European Jewish culture destroyed, ancient cities reduced to rubble, and empires that had stood for centuries swept away in months. But statistics alone cannot capture the human drama that unfolded between 1939 and 1945. This was a war fought not just on battlefields, but in the skies, beneath the seas, in factories and laboratories, and, perhaps most crucially, in the hearts and minds of citizens around the globe. The cast of characters reads like an epic novel: the charismatic evil of Adolf Hitler, the bulldog determination of Winston Churchill, the calm strength of Franklin Roosevelt, the brutal calculation of Joseph Stalin. Yet equally compelling are the countless unsung heroes: the French resistance fighter, the Russian tank driver, the American factory worker, the Japanese-American soldier fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family. We live today in a world born from their choices, their sacrifices, and their courage. The United Nations, nuclear weapons, the Cold War, the modern Middle East, the European Union, all emerged from the crucible of World War II. Even now, nearly 8 decades later, its shadows and lessons loom over every international crisis and conflict. This is their story. It is our story. And it begins in the gathering darkness of the 1930s, as a wounded world was about to discover that the war to end all wars had been merely a prelude to an even greater cataclysm: the rise and reign of dictators. Adolf Hitler's first attempt at seizing power ended in farce. On a chilly November evening in 1923, the failed art student and decorated World War I veteran led 2,000 followers into Munich streets, convinced he could spark a revolution. By morning, 16 of his men lay dead, and the self-proclaimed savior of Germany fled the scene, only to be captured 2 days later while hiding in a friend's attic. He spent the next year in prison, nursing his wounded pride and dictating Mein Kampf to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess. A decade later, he was Chancellor of Germany. This breathtaking transformation, from beer hall rabble-rouser to absolute dictator, remains one of history's most chilling political success stories. Hitler mastered the art of mass manipulation, turning Germany's democratic institutions against themselves. His rallies became masterpieces of political theater, with searchlights piercing the night sky, endless columns of torch-bearing stormtroopers, and hypnotic speeches that could hold hundreds of thousands spellbound for hours. But Hitler wasn't alone in his rise to power. Across Europe and Asia, democracy was in retreat. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already blazed the fascist trail, transforming himself from socialist journalist to Il Duce, the leader. His theatrical style, he practiced his facial expressions in mirrors, and promised to restore Roman glory, seduced Italy's elite and masses alike. "It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep," he proclaimed, while systematically crushing all opposition. Meanwhile, on the far side of the Eurasian landmass, Imperial Japan fell under the control of military zealots who saw conquest as divine destiny. General Hideki Tojo, with his wire-rimmed glasses and bureaucratic manner, seemed an unlikely warrior. Yet he would help transform Japan into a military machine that believed death was preferable to surrender. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin was perfecting a different kind of tyranny. Unlike his fellow dictators, he shunned mass rallies and dramatic speeches. His power lay in bureaucratic manipulation and midnight terror. While Hitler ranted and Mussolini posed, Stalin signed death warrants with a red pencil, methodically destroying not just his enemies but entire social classes. These men shared more than their appetite for power. Each tapped into a profound national humiliation: Germany's defeat in World War I, Italy's mutilated victory, Japan's perceived disrespect by Western powers, Russia's long backwardness. They promised not just prosperity, but destiny, a chance for their people to claim their rightful place in history through strength, violence, and will. Their timing was perfect. The Great Depression had shaken faith in democracy and capitalism. The carnage of World War I had destroyed old certainties about progress and civilization. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped men promising simple solutions to complex problems, offering the comfort of absolute certainty in an uncertain world. They built their power on modern technology but promoted ancient myths. Hitler talked of Aryan supermen while using radio to reach millions. Mussolini evoked Roman legions while obsessing over modern aircraft. Japan's militarists celebrated the samurai code through waves of Zero fighters. Stalin employed cutting-edge propaganda while creating a personality cult worthy of ancient emperors. By 1935, these dictators had transformed their nations into works of terrible political art. Germany's autobahns hummed with military traffic. Italy's trains ran on time. Japan's factories worked around the clock. The Soviet Union's industrial might grew daily. Their peoples marched in perfect formation, sang approved songs, and learned to fear the midnight knock at the door. Yet for all their power, these men were haunted by paranoia. Hitler survived multiple assassination attempts, real and imagined. Mussolini kept his own detailed police files on prominent Italians. Stalin saw traitors everywhere, eventually destroying most of his old revolutionary comrades. Even at the height of their power, the dictators lived in fear of each other, of their own people, of the democracies they despised but secretly envied. They were also prisoners of their own ideologies. Having promised greatness through conquest, they would eventually have to deliver or face the consequences. The very forces they had unleashed, militarism, ultranationalism, racial hatred, would drive them toward a conflict none of them could fully control. The stage was set. The dictators had remade their nations into weapons. Now they only needed a spark to set the world aflame. That spark would come, not from the obvious places like Germany or Japan, but from a diplomatic dance between Hitler and Stalin that would shock the world and begin the countdown to catastrophe. The hour was growing late for the democracies. But in London, Paris, and Washington, leaders still clung to the hope that the dictators could be reasoned with, contained, appeased. They were about to learn, at terrible cost, how wrong they were. Democracy's struggle in the 1930s. Wall Street's collapse in 1929 sent more than stock certificates into free fall. It shattered the West's faith in itself. As breadlines replaced bank lines and shanty towns sprang up in the shadows of silent factories, democracy faced its greatest test since the French Revolution. The numbers told only part of the story. In America, 15 million unemployed. In Britain, entire towns abandoned to rust and despair. In France, 36 governments in 20 years. But the real crisis was spiritual. Every morning, men who had once supported families put on their last good suit and wandered the streets, pretending to look for work that didn't exist. Former shop owners sold apples on corners. War veterans who had survived the trenches of the Great War couldn't feed their children in the supposed peace that followed. The proud democracies seemed paralyzed. President Herbert Hoover, brilliant at organizing Belgian relief in World War I, appeared helpless before the domestic catastrophe. Britain's political class, masters of a global empire, couldn't master unemployment in Manchester or Liverpool. The French built the mighty Maginot Line to defend their borders while their democracy crumbled from within. Into this vacuum rushed a flood of extreme solutions. Oswald Mosley, dashing Great War veteran and former rising star of the British Labour Party, founded his British Union of Fascists. In France, the Action Française dreamed of restoring the monarchy. American demagogues like Father Charles Coughlin and Huey Long gathered millions of followers with radio rants against bankers and promises of shared wealth. Even Franklin Roosevelt, democracy's most gifted defender, flirted with autocratic power during his first 100 days. If Congress fails to act and the national emergency is still critical, he warned, I shall accept the responsibility and I will act. The distinction between him and the dictators lay not in the power he wielded, but in his willingness to eventually lay that power down. The Spanish Civil War became democracy's dress rehearsal for defeat. When fascist generals rose against Spain's elected government in 1936, the Western democracies stood aside. They watched as Hitler and Mussolini armed the rebels while Stalin manipulated the Republic's defenders. Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell witnessed idealistic young men from around the world travel to fight for democracy, only to be crushed between fascist hammers and communist anvils. Madrid's fall in 1939 seemed to confirm that democracy's time had passed. The pattern repeated across Europe. Austria, birthplace of Hitler and bastion of Central European culture, fell to Nazi pressure without a shot in 1938. The Führer rode into Vienna as flowers rained down from windows that had once displayed Beethoven's sheet music. Czechoslovakia, the continent's only remaining democracy east of France, was abandoned by its allies at Munich that same year. The Munich conference captured democracy's humiliation in a single photograph: Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Édouard Daladier, supposedly the continent's most powerful men, meekly accepting Hitler's demands. I believe it is peace for our time, Chamberlain declared, waving his worthless agreement. Behind closed doors, Daladier was more honest. The fools, he muttered of the cheering crowds, if they knew what they were applauding. Even America, protected by two oceans and a tradition of independence, turned inward. The Neutrality Acts, designed to prevent entanglement in foreign wars, handcuffed President Roosevelt's ability to aid democracy abroad. Charles Lindbergh, the era's greatest hero, toured Nazi Germany and returned to praise its strength while dismissing its brutality. The America First movement attracted millions with a simple message: democracy needed saving at home before it could be defended abroad. Yet beneath the surface, democracy's defenders were stirring. Winston Churchill, exiled to Parliament's back benches for his anti-Nazi warnings, kept detailed files on German rearmament. French officers like Charles de Gaulle argued vainly for modernizing their army. Roosevelt, understanding that America's oceans were shrinking in the age of air power, began a careful campaign to awaken his nation. They were voices in the wilderness until events proved them prophets. But by then, democracy's retreat had left a vacuum that only blood and iron could fill. The dictators had been given their chance. Now they would take everything else. The next move would come from the most ruthless player on the board. Stalin, watching democracy retreat, decided to make a deal with his ideological opposite. The Nazi-Soviet pact would shock the world and set the final act in motion. The only question was, when the dominoes began to fall, would democracy find the strength to rise again? Prelude to World War II, the last chances for peace. In the spring of 1939, a strange calm settled over Europe. Diplomats shuttled between capitals carrying proposals and counter-proposals. The press debated whether Hitler was satisfied with his bloodless victories. Tourist season began in Paris as usual. But beneath this normal surface, the drums of war beat ever louder. Poland was the key. Caught between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, this proud nation of cavalry officers and ancient castles held the continent's fate in its hands. The Nazi demand seemed simple: return the port city of Danzig to German control. But everyone understood this was merely the opening bid. Hitler had used the same strategy with Austria and Czechoslovakia: first a small demand, then total conquest. The Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck cut a dramatic figure in European capitals that spring. Aristocratic, multilingual, and razor-sharp, he knew his nation faced an impossible choice. Poland will not be pushed back 1 inch, he declared to thunderous applause in Warsaw. But privately, he understood that without firm Western support, his country was doomed. Britain and France finally drew their line in the sand. After years of retreat, they guaranteed Poland's independence. The same governments that had abandoned Czechoslovakia now pledged to fight for Warsaw. Hitler, meeting with his generals, mocked these guarantees. "I saw our enemies at Munich," he sneered. "They are little worms." The summer of 1939 unfolded like a diplomatic thriller. British diplomats proposed an alliance with the Soviet Union, hoping to surround Germany. French military planners dusted off invasion plans. Italian Foreign Minister Count Ciano visited Hitler's mountain retreat and was shocked by the Führer's determination for war. "The die is cast," he wrote in his diary. "The most interesting part is that no one wants war." Then came the thunderbolt. On August 23rd, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop landed in Moscow. Within hours, he and Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov signed a non-aggression pact that changed everything. Two sworn enemies, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be the first victim. The news hit Western capitals like a physical blow. Communist parties across Europe, who had spent years calling for opposition to Hitler, suddenly found themselves defending cooperation with fascism. Anti-fascist writers who had praised Stalin as democracy's last hope fell silent. In Tokyo, the Japanese government fell, its entire strategy of alignment with Germany against Russia now in shambles. The final week of peace was filled with desperate improvisations. British Prime Minister Chamberlain, his policy of appeasement in ruins, wrote directly to Hitler proposing international talks. Rome's Mussolini, not yet ready for war, suggested a new international conference. President Roosevelt appealed to both Hitler and Poland's President Mashiki to choose negotiations over conflict. Hitler's replies grew shorter, more contemptuous. He had trapped himself in his own rhetoric, promised his people too much conquest, built an economy that could only sustain itself through plunder. Peace would mean admitting that his previous victories were enough. And Adolf Hitler had never believed in enough. In the early hours of August 31st, SS operatives in Polish uniforms staged a fake attack on a German radio station. Hitler had his pretext. As German tanks prepared to roll, as Polish cavalry units took up their positions, as RAF pilots slept near their fighters, the world held its breath. The next morning, September 1st, 1939, a German battleship opened fire on Polish positions in Danzig. The diplomatic dances were over. Now the tanks would do the talking. Democracy had retreated as far as it could. The next moves would be measured not in diplomatic notes, but in blood, flames, and steel. The Second World War was about to begin. The onset of mechanized warfare, Poland's agony. The first shots of World War II weren't fired by tanks or infantry, but from the sky. At 4:40 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, waves of German Stuka dive bombers screamed down on the Polish town of Wielon. Their target wasn't a military installation, but a sleeping civilian population. Within hours, 75% of the town's center lay in ruins. The Nazi strategy was clear. This wouldn't be a gentleman's war. The Wehrmacht had invented an entirely new way of fighting. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry in a deadly symphony of destruction. Polish defenders, still relying on cavalry and fixed defenses, found themselves encircled before they could even locate the enemy's main thrust. German panzer divisions sliced through Polish lines like hot knives through butter, while the Luftwaffe owned the skies. In Berlin, Hitler watched with cold satisfaction as his generals' predictions proved accurate. The Polish army, caught between German hammers and Soviet anvils, began to disintegrate. The Führer had promised his people a quick victory. For once, he would deliver exactly what he promised. The human drama played out in countless individual tragedies. Outside Krojanty, Polish cavalry actually did charge German tanks, not out of foolishness but desperate necessity, buying time for infantry to retreat. In the Tuchola forest, entire Polish divisions vanished into German traps. Young Wehrmacht soldiers, raised on Nazi propaganda, found themselves shocked by their own brutality as they executed Polish intellectuals and community leaders according to pre-prepared lists. Warsaw became the symbol of Poland's defiance. The capital's radio station broadcast Chopin's music day and night, interrupted only by air raid warnings and proclamations of resistance. Mayor Stefan Starzyński's voice carried across the airwaves. This is Warsaw. Warsaw fighting. Warsaw still fighting. The city endured 1,150 bomber sorties on September 25th alone. England and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on Germany but launched no major operations. The Poles' bitter nickname for this betrayal, the Phony War, captured their abandonment. As Warsaw burned, the Western Allies dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany. Polish soldiers would never forget this lesson about the value of diplomatic guarantees. The killing stroke came on September 17th. Stalin, right on Hitler's schedule, sent the Red Army across Poland's eastern border. The Soviets called it liberation. The Poles called it the knife in the back. Caught between mechanized giants, the Polish army fought on with medieval courage but modern consequences. The human cost defied imagination. The Germans tested their race theories in Polish villages, separating Aryan-looking children from their parents for adoption by German families. Soviet NKVD squads rounded up Polish officers and intellectuals for execution in the Katyn Forest, a massacre they would blame on Germans. Jewish communities, caught between Nazi racial hatred and Soviet class warfare, began their descent into hell. Warsaw finally surrendered on September 27th after running out of food, water, and ammunition. The last Polish field army laid down its arms on October 6th. In just 36 days, a nation of 35 million people had been erased from the map. Poland vanished into the dark maw of dual occupation, its territory divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, like thieves sharing spoils. The world had witnessed something new: warfare at the speed of the internal combustion engine, genocide enabled by modern bureaucracy, terror amplified by radio and camera. The old rules of war, if they had ever really existed, were dead. A new era of mechanized savagery had begun. In London and Paris, leaders who had promised to defend Poland now faced their own moment of truth. Their declarations of war remained empty words without action. But Poland's swift destruction raised haunting questions. If the Wehrmacht could do this to a nation of 35 million in 5 weeks, what could it do to others? And how long before Hitler's appetites turned westward? The answer would come soon enough. The phony war was about to end, and Western Europe would learn firsthand what the Poles already knew. No one was safe from the whirlwind Hitler had unleashed. The year of Blitzkrieg, Hitler's triumph, and the fall of nations. Spring 1940 arrived with an eerie calm. For 7 months after Poland's fall, Western Europe held its breath. The French crouched behind their Maginot Line. The British sent an expeditionary force to France, more symbolic than strategic. In Berlin, Hitler's generals called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. But like the calm before a tornado, this peace masked gathering forces of unprecedented destruction. On April 9th, the storm broke. German troops seized Denmark in 4 hours. Nobody had ever conquered a country before breakfast. Norway fell next, despite the Royal Navy's desperate attempts to intervene. Hitler's new strategy was clear. No neutral nation would remain to threaten his flanks. May 10th marked the real apocalypse. The Wehrmacht struck west with stunning violence. Holland's army collapsed in 5 days. The Dutch hadn't fought a major war since Napoleon. Now they learned modern warfare at its most brutal. Rotterdam burned under Luftwaffe bombs, a preview of horrors to come. But the real masterstroke targeted France. Instead of attacking through the heavily defended Belgian plains, as every French general expected, German panzers punched through the impassable Ardennes forest. The French Ninth Army dissolved in panic. British and French forces rushed north to meet an attack that was already behind them. The speed defied comprehension. Radio reports couldn't keep up with German advances. French commanders, trained to think in terms of miles per week, now faced an enemy that moved dozens of miles per day. The proud French army, considered the world's finest in 1939, shattered like glass under the hammer of Blitzkrieg. General Heinz Guderian's panzers reached the English Channel on May 20th, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and the flower of the French army in a pocket around Dunkirk. Hitler had achieved in 10 days what the Kaiser's armies couldn't accomplish in 4 years of World War I. Then came the miracle. Hitler, either through caution or hubris, halted his panzers short of Dunkirk. The British launched Operation Dynamo, the legendary evacuation. While RAF Spitfires dueled Messerschmitts overhead, a flotilla of military vessels and civilian boats plucked 338,000 Allied troops from the beaches. London rejoiced at this triumph of survival. Berlin sneered at Britain's greatest retreat. Paris fell on June 14th. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées as Adolf Hitler conducted his only foreign tour of conquest. In one photograph, he poses like a tourist in front of the Eiffel Tower. Behind his triumphant smile lay a stunning reality. Nazi Germany now controlled territory from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. That summer marked democracy's darkest hour. Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill, who had replaced the discredited Chamberlain as Prime Minister, rallied his people with immortal words. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." But words couldn't stop bullets. The RAF had only 600 fighters to defend against 2,600 Luftwaffe aircraft. The Battle of Britain began as an exercise in cold mathematics. German bombers struck RAF bases with clinical precision. Radar stations burned. Airfields cratered. British fighter strength dropped critically low. Then Hitler, enraged by a small British raid on Berlin, ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets from military installations to London itself. It was his first major strategic mistake. While Londoners sheltered in underground stations, RAF fighters got precious time to repair, rebuild, and train new pilots. The night sky over Britain became a theater of desperate combat. German bombers scattered their payload over burning cities. RAF night fighters hunted by moonlight. Neither side had ever fought a major air war before. They wrote the rules in blood and aviation fuel. By October, it was clear Britain would survive. Hitler postponed his invasion plans. But the cost was staggering. 43,000 British civilians dead, historic cities in ruins, and the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility shattered. The British had proven that Hitler could be stopped, barely at massive cost, but stopped nonetheless. Yet even as Britain celebrated survival, Hitler turned his gaze eastward. His generals were already planning something far bigger than the French campaign. The coming year would see the largest invasion in human history, as the Wehrmacht prepared to strike the Soviet Union. But for now, in the winter of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at his zenith. He controlled more of Europe than any conqueror since Napoleon. The only question was, would he know when to stop? The answer would reshape the world. Operation Barbarossa, the turning point of World War II. Dawn broke over Eastern Europe on June 22, 1941, as 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border. The largest invasion force in military history moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every unit had its target, every commander his objective. Hitler had told his generals this would be a war of annihilation. Even by Nazi standards, what followed was unprecedented. The operation's name, Barbarossa, after a medieval German emperor, revealed Hitler's grandiose vision. This wasn't just a military campaign, but a crusade. European civilization against Asian barbarism, Nazi ideology against Bolshevism, the Aryan race against what Hitler called Jewish Bolshevism. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Stalin's reaction bordered on paralysis. Having convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't attack, he refused to believe initial reports of the invasion. Soviet pilots were ordered not to fire back, lest they provoke the Germans. By noon, the Luftwaffe had destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most still parked wingtip to wingtip on their airfields. The human scale of Barbarossa dwarfed everything before it. 3 massive German army groups, north, center, and south, drove toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Panzer divisions advanced up to 50 miles per day. Entire Soviet armies disappeared into vast encirclements. German soldiers were stunned to find themselves taking more prisoners than they could handle. Behind the front lines, darkness fell. The Wehrmacht was followed by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads tasked with eliminating Jews, communists, and other undesirables. Villages vanished. Mass graves filled. The line between military operation and genocide blurred. This was a new kind of war, where ideology trumped humanity. Soviet resistance stiffened as shock gave way to rage. The Germans discovered that Russian tanks, especially the new T-34, could outmatch their panzers. Red Army soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing surrender often meant death. A wounded Soviet commissar, surrounded by Germans, radioed his last words: "I die, but I do not surrender. Victory will be ours." By August, the Wehrmacht had advanced 400 miles and inflicted over 3 million casualties on the Red Army. Hitler boasted that Russia is already broken and will never rise again. But his generals were less certain. Their supply lines stretched to breaking point. The Russian autumn rains turned roads to mud. And still the Soviets fought on. Hitler faced a critical decision. His generals wanted to drive straight for Moscow, the Soviet nerve center. But Hitler, obsessed with economic targets, diverted forces to capture Ukraine's resources and Leningrad's industries. The delay proved fatal. By the time the Wehrmacht resumed its drive on Moscow, autumn had turned to winter. The scene before Moscow that December became apocalyptic. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, froze at their posts. Tank engines refused to start in minus 40-degree temperatures. Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia, troops trained and equipped for winter warfare. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was pushed back. Berlin radio stopped announcing victories. Hitler refused to authorize retreats, ordering troops to fight to the last man. A new phrase entered German military vocabulary: Kremlin fever, the mix of frostbite, terror, and nervous exhaustion that broke hardened veterans. The Soviet counteroffensive revealed the Wehrmacht's vulnerability. The German army that had seemed unstoppable in June now struggled to hold any line. Stalin, recovering his nerve, broadcast a defiant message: the German invaders are facing disaster. The myth of German invincibility has been shattered. Barbarossa marked the war's turning point. The Wehrmacht lost 800,000 men, more than in all previous campaigns combined. But the real disaster was strategic. Hitler had opened a two-front war, precisely the nightmare that had doomed Germany in World War I. Even worse, his racial policies turned potential Soviet allies against him. Millions of Ukrainians and others who might have welcomed the Germans as liberators instead faced them as genocidal invaders. Yet the cost to the Soviet Union was staggering. 27 million Soviets would die before the war ended. Entire cities disappeared. The countrysides of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia became moonscapes. Stalin had survived, but his empire lay in ruins. As 1941 drew to a close, another power was preparing to enter the war, one that would transform a European conflict into a truly global catastrophe. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was just weeks away. The year that began with Barbarossa would end with the world in flames, the awakening of a sleeping giant, the impact of Pearl Harbor. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor's waters mirrored a perfect Hawaiian sky as sailors aboard the USS Arizona prepared to raise the American flag. At 7:55 a.m., the peace shattered. Japanese dive bombers screamed from the clouds, their wing-mounted cameras recording history, the opening act of a Pacific War that would redraw the global map. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew America intimately and feared her industrial might. "I can run wild for 6 months," he warned his government. "After that, I guarantee nothing." But Japan's militarists wouldn't listen. They had already convinced themselves that the decadent Americans would sue for peace after one sharp blow. The attack's precision stunned military observers. 2 waves of Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers struck their targets with surgical accuracy. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. The Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, taking 1,177 sailors to their graves. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds in her hull. Navy divers would hear tapping from trapped survivors for days. Yet the raid missed crucial targets. America's aircraft carriers were at sea. The fuel tanks and repair facilities remained intact. Even more significantly, the attack unified a divided nation. The next day, as Roosevelt addressed Congress, isolationism died. The America First movement dissolved overnight. Charles Lindbergh, who had opposed intervention, requested return to active duty. Japan's initial victories seemed to justify their gamble. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila followed in January. Singapore, Britain's Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February, the worst defeat in British military history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March. By May, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Indian border to the South Pacific. But beneath these triumphs lay fatal miscalculations. Japan had gained territory, but not strategic depth. Each conquered island required garrison troops and supplies. The empire's supply lines stretched across vast ocean spaces, vulnerable to submarine attack. Worst of all, Japan's leaders had fundamentally misread the American character. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor was unprecedented in human history. Detroit's auto plants converted to tank production in weeks. Aircraft factories operated around the clock. Liberty ships slid down the ways at the rate of 1 every 8 days. A nation that had struggled to arm itself now supplied weapons to the entire Allied cause. American rage found its first expression in April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the Carrier Hornet on a one-way mission to bomb Tokyo. The physical damage was minimal. The psychological impact was enormous. Japan had lost its aura of invulnerability. The Japanese Navy rushed to complete its strategic victory. Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure America's remaining carriers into a trap near Midway Island. But American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval code. As Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway, American carriers were already lying in wait. The resulting battle lasted minutes but shaped decades. On June 4th, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft. Within 5 minutes, the heart of Japan's carrier force was burning. A 4th carrier died that afternoon. Japan lost not just ships, but irreplaceable veteran pilots. The empire had reached its high water mark. Back home, America's mobilization transformed society itself. Women entered factories by the millions. African American workers fled the rural South for industrial jobs, beginning a great migration that would reshape American cities. The West Coast boomed as shipyards and aircraft plants worked at fever pitch. But darkness stained the home front too. Fear and racism led to the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Families who had lived in California for generations found themselves in desert camps, their loyalty questioned, their property seized. It was democracy's greatest wartime failure, made worse because it was done legally with Supreme Court approval. By year's end, the strategic picture had transformed. American submarines stalked Japanese shipping lanes. New factories poured out weapons in unprecedented numbers. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it was angry. Japan's leaders had gambled everything on a quick victory. Instead, they had embarked on a long defeat. The only question was how many would die before they admitted. The turning point of World War II, 1942. History's hinge creaked slowly in 1942. 3 battles, fought on 3 continents, would determine humanity's future. Midway in the Pacific, El Alamein in North Africa, and Stalingrad on the Russian steppes. Each began as a gamble. Each ended as a turning point. The Midway miracle unfolded like a Hollywood script. 4 American carriers faced 4 Japanese carriers in a vast expanse of Pacific Ocean. Both sides launched aircraft into empty skies, searching desperately for each other's ships. Then, at 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, American dive bombers emerged from the clouds at precisely the moment Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, their decks packed with refueling aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers died in 5 minutes. The 4th burned that afternoon. Admiral Yamamoto's worst fears had come true. Japan had lost its offensive striking power in a single morning. But the true significance lay deeper. Japan could replace ships, but not the 3,000 experienced aviators and mechanics who died at Midway. The empire had lost its veteran corps. Meanwhile, in the North African desert, 2 generals fought a different kind of duel. Britain's Bernard Montgomery faced Germany's Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, in a contest of supply and deception. Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed to within 60 miles of Alexandria, threatening the Suez Canal and Middle East oil fields. But Montgomery, unlike his predecessors, refused to be rushed into battle. El Alamein became a mathematician's war. Montgomery accumulated shells, tanks, and fuel with accountant's precision. Rommel, at the end of a 500-mile supply line, watched his resources dwindle. The battle began October 23rd with the largest artillery barrage since World War I. British guns fired 600 tons of shells in 20 minutes. After 12 days of brutal combat, Rommel retreated. The Desert Fox would never again threaten Egypt. But these battles paled beside the apocalypse at Stalingrad. Hitler, obsessed with taking the city bearing Stalin's name, poured 500,000 men into street fighting more savage than anything in modern history. Snipers dueled in factory ruins. Infantry fought room by room through apartment blocks. The average Soviet soldier's life expectancy dropped to 24 hours. Then winter struck. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Uranus on November 19th, sending fresh Siberian divisions around Stalingrad's flanks. The German 6th Army, focused on taking the city block by block, suddenly found itself surrounded. Hitler forbade retreat. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus begged for permission to break out. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal instead, noting that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus surrendered anyway. Of 91,000 Germans trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only 5,000 would ever return home. The last German radio transmission from the city read simply, "Russians at the door. We are preparing to destroy the radios." Then silence. But 1942's transformations weren't limited to battlefields. The Holocaust shifted into high gear as the Wannsee Conference systematized genocide. Death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau expanded operations. By year's end, nearly 2 million European Jews had been murdered. Science reshaped warfare daily. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, led by Alan Turing, cracked Germany's Enigma cipher. American submarines deployed new magnetic torpedoes. German scientists raced to develop wonder weapons that might reverse the tide. In the New Mexico desert, American physicists began the Manhattan Project, an endeavor that would remake the very nature of war and peace. The home fronts transformed too. American women riveted bombers while their husbands flew them. British children wore gas masks to school. Soviet teenagers manned factory lathes. German civilians endured the first major bombing raids on their cities. The line between soldier and civilian blurred as entire societies mobilized for total war. By December 1942, the strategic picture had shifted fundamentally. Germany fought defensive battles on all fronts. Japan's empire had reached its limits. Italy's military reputation lay in ruins. The Axis powers had shot their bolt. Now they faced the full industrial might of an aroused America, the endless manpower of the Soviet Union, and the dogged determination of a battered but unbowed Britain. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The only questions were how long it would take, and how many more would die before the end. 1942 had answered the question of whether democracy would survive. 1943 would begin to answer how much winning would cost. The industrial might of World War II. Detroit automaker Henry Ford once claimed he could smell a wasted dollar from 50 feet away. By 1943, his legendary River Rouge plant wasn't producing a single civilian car. Instead, it churned out B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of one every hour. America hadn't just gone to war, it had become war. The numbers staggered imagination. In 1941, America produced 1,100 combat aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,300. A single American shipyard, Kaiser's in Richmond, California, built more tonnage than the entire Japanese naval industry. Pittsburgh steel mills glowed red day and night, their furnaces consuming more electricity than Sweden and Norway combined. But statistics tell only part of the story. The real revolution happened in countless small innovations. Engineers at Bell Aircraft discovered they could spot weld airplane parts instead of using rivets, saving crucial seconds per operation. Workers at Douglas Aircraft developed a way to preheat rivets, reducing installation time from 3 minutes to 30 seconds. A housewife in Michigan suggested using paper cups instead of metal containers for aircraft paint, saving tons of precious aluminum. The Soviet Union performed its own industrial miracle in even more desperate circumstances. As German armies approached Moscow, entire factories were dismantled and shipped east by rail. Machinery from Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk tank plant arrived in the Ural Mountains, still warm from operation. Within weeks, tanks rolled off assembly lines that had been meadows months before. Women transformed both the workplace and warfare itself. Rosie the Riveter became an American icon, but her sisters worked everywhere. British women assembled Spitfires, Soviet women sniped from Stalingrad's ruins, Japanese women crafted military electronics. The notion that warfare was exclusively men's work died forever in the factories of World War II. Science itself became a weapon. The MIT Radiation Laboratory developed microwave radar that could spot submarine periscopes. Harvard researchers created napalm. The University of California at Berkeley turned into a vast physics experiment as the Manhattan Project consumed enough electricity to power a small city. Britain's contribution was intellectual rather than industrial. Bletchley Park's codebreakers, led by brilliant misfits like Alan Turing, cracked German ciphers with room-sized computers. RAF scientists perfected aerial navigation systems that turned night bombing from an exercise in hope to a precise science. A Scottish radar expert named Robert Watson Watt developed systems that saved Britain during the Blitz. But the war's greatest production achievement may have been psychological. Democracy, long mocked by dictators as weak and inefficient, proved more adaptable than totalitarianism. American factory workers suggested improvements their German counterparts would never dare propose. British industries decentralized to survive bombing, while Hitler's rigid centralization created bottlenecks. The German response to Allied production revealed deep cultural flaws. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, performed organizational miracles, but couldn't overcome the Nazi regime's fundamental contradictions. German factories used slave labor while American plants paid overtime. German scientists worked in isolation while Allied researchers shared discoveries. German industry remained artisanal, focused on complex, perfect weapons, while Allied industry embraced standardization and simplicity. Japan's situation proved even worse. Its economy, only 1/10 America's size, tried to support conquest of territory larger than Napoleon's empire. By 1943, American factories produced more aircraft every month than Japan could build in a year. Japanese workers still filed aircraft parts by hand, while American assembly lines used precision dies. The human cost of this industrial race mounted daily. Soviet factory workers collapsed at their machines after 18-hour shifts. American miners died extracting the copper and aluminum that fed the war machine. German slave laborers perished building V-2 rockets in underground factories. The line between combat and production blurred as Allied bombers struck German industrial cities with increasing fury. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. By late 1943, American factories produced a Liberty ship every 8 hours. A new Sherman tank rolled off assembly lines every 30 minutes. A Fletcher-class destroyer slid down the ways every week. The arsenal of democracy had become a reality. Hitler had sneered that democratic shopkeepers could never match Nazi efficiency. Now those shopkeepers buried his Reich in an avalanche of materials. The production war would be won not by genius weapons, but by the crushing weight of Allied industrial might. The question was no longer whether democracy would win, but how many would die before victory arrived. The evolution and impact of strategic bombing in WW2. Night over Berlin, 1943. Searchlights stabbed the darkness as Lancaster bombers dropped streams of tinfoil to confuse German radar. Below, air raid sirens wailed their banshee cry. RAF navigator John White scribbled in his log, "City burning like a volcano. Never seen anything like it. God help those below." The strategic bombing campaign marked warfare's next evolution. Cities that had taken centuries to build vanished in hours. Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, names that became synonymous with destruction from above. This was a new kind of war, fought in 3 dimensions, where civilian morale became as legitimate a target as factories or rail yards. RAF Bomber. Command's Arthur Bomber Harris had an iron conviction. Germany, which had terrorized Europe from the air, must reap the whirlwind. His nighttime area bombing raids targeted entire cities. "They sowed the wind," he declared, "and now they will reap the whirlwind." The British public, remembering the Blitz, largely agreed. American generals preferred precision daylight bombing, targeting specific factories and transportation hubs. Theory met reality in the skies over Europe. Without escort fighters, B-17 crews discovered that precision bombing meant fighting through clouds of German interceptors and flak so thick airmen said you could walk on it. The human cost proved staggering. RAF Bomber Command suffered 55% casualties, worse than World War I infantry officers. The US 8th Air Force lost more men than the entire Marine Corps. German civilians died by the hundreds of thousands. The moral calculus became impossible. How many Allied airmen's lives were worth saving by area bombing? How many German civilians could justifiably die to shorten the war by 1 day? Technology drove the escalation. British scientists invented oboe and H-2S radar for nighttime navigation. American engineers developed the Norden bombsight for daylight precision. German defenders countered with radar-guided flak, night fighters, and the first surface-to-air missiles. The aerial arms race consumed both sides' best scientific minds. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. Finally, Allied bombers had an escort fighter with the range to reach Berlin. German aircraft production actually peaked in 1944, but trained pilots became irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe died slowly in the skies over Germany, its veteran pilots lost in a war of attrition they couldn't win. Japan faced even worse destruction. B-29 superfortresses, each costing more than the Manhattan Project, brought American air power to Japanese cities. General Curtis LeMay, frustrated by high-altitude precision bombing, switched to low-level incendiary raids. On March 9, 1945, Tokyo burned. The firestorm killed more civilians than either atomic bomb would. The human stories defy comprehension. German children in Dresden learned to identify Allied aircraft by engine sound. British families emerged from shelters to find entire streets erased. Japanese survivors spoke of black rain falling after firebomb raids. American airmen, many just teenagers, flew through flak so thick it clanged off their aircraft like hail on a tin roof. Strategic bombing's effectiveness remained debatable. German war production increased until late 1944, despite the destruction. Civilian morale bent but never broke. The real impact came in forced dispersal of industry, disruption of transportation, and destruction of oil facilities. By 1945, the German war machine ran dry, its tanks and aircraft grounded by lack of fuel. The moral debate continues today. Were the civilian deaths justified by shortened war? Did area bombing undermine the Allies' moral authority? The questions have no easy answers. RAF bomber crews weren't allowed to wear their medals in public for years after the war, their victory tainted by the means of its achievement. But in the war's final months, as V-2 rockets fell on London and kamikazes struck American ships, few questioned the bombing campaign's necessity. Technology had created a new kind of war. The only defense against strategic bombing was to ensure it never happened again. That hope died in August 1945 when a single B-29 named Enola Gay approached Hiroshima carrying a new kind of weapon. The atomic age would make strategic bombing look like a primitive prelude to even greater horror. The liberation of Europe, D-Day and beyond. Dawn broke over the English Channel on June 6, 1944, revealing the largest armada in human history. 6,000 ships stretched to the horizon. The liberation of Europe was about to begin. A young soldier in the first wave scribbled in his diary, "God help me. God help us all." Within hours, he and thousands like him would transform the impossible into the inevitable. Operation Overlord represented democracy's greatest gamble. Every Allied advantage, industrial might, naval power, air superiority, focused on 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The invasion force carried not just weapons, but the fate of civilization. Failure would mean at least another year of Nazi rule in Europe. The Germans had expected invasion, but not here, not now. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had fortified the French coast with millions of obstacles and mines, boasting that the Atlantic Wall would make invasion suicidal. But on D-Day morning, Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. Hitler slept late, his generals afraid to wake him with news of the invasion. The human elements proved decisive. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne descended into chaos behind Utah Beach, their units scattered across Normandy. Instead of paralyzing them, the confusion paralyzed German response. Small groups of Americans improvised, adapted, and fought. By dawn, they had secured crucial crossroads and bridges, though many didn't know exactly where they were. Omaha Beach became an abattoir. The first waves faced intact German defenses and rough seas that swamped their tanks. Combat engineer Sergeant Philip Stretzig later recalled, "You could walk on the floating bodies from the beach to the seawall." But individuals changed history. Colonel George Taylor rallied shell-shocked troops with words that became legend. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get moving." British and Canadian forces faced their own trials on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. A young British lieutenant watched his men advance through a minefield. They walked like old men, shoulders hunched as if walking through rain. But they kept walking. By nightfall, the Allies had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The next phase brought different challenges. The hedgerow country of Normandy favored defenders. Every field became a fortress, every sunken lane an ambush site. American tankers welded steel prongs to their Shermans to break through hedgerows. Infantry developed new tactics for clearing the deadly maze. Progress was measured in hedgerows per day, paid for in blood. Then came the breakout. Operation Cobra shattered German defenses with carpet bombing. General George Patton's Third Army exploded through the gap, advancing so fast that tanks ran out of fuel. French resistance fighters emerged from hiding to guide the advance. Paris rose in rebellion as German forces crumbled. The human drama peaked in August. Hitler ordered his armies to counterattack at Mortain, trying to cut off Patton's advance. The 30th Infantry Division stopped them cold. German Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, facing defeat, committed suicide. The Wehrmacht began a headlong retreat from France. Meanwhile, a second invasion struck southern France. Operation Dragoon landed American and French forces near Marseille. The German commander, declaring the situation hopeless, surrendered his entire army. German soldiers fled north in commandeered horses and bicycles, their vaunted mechanized warfare reduced to medieval chaos. Paris liberated itself on August 25th. French resistance fighters struck as German morale collapsed. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German commander, defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city. French General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées as snipers still fired from rooftops. But triumph bred new problems. Allied supply lines stretched to breaking point. Troops outran their fuel and ammunition. The Red Ball Express, mostly African-American truck drivers, worked miracles to keep armies moving, but even they couldn't defy logistics forever. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's September gamble to cross the Rhine, failed spectacularly. Allied forces had finally reached their limit. As autumn rains began, the Wehrmacht found time to regroup. The war that everyone hoped would end by Christmas would instead grind on through Europe's worst winter in decades. Yet D-Day had sealed Nazi Germany's fate. The question was no longer whether Hitler would lose, but how many more would die before he admitted defeat. The final battles would be fought not for victory, but for the shape of post-war Europe. The fall of the Third Reich, a chronicle of the end. December 16th, 1944. Through the pre-dawn fog of the Ardennes forest, German tanks rolled forward in complete silence. Operation Autumn Mist, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had begun. American soldiers, many still sleeping, awoke to find the Wehrmacht had achieved the impossible, complete strategic surprise. The Battle of the Bulge embodied the Third Reich's final convulsion. Hitler threw everything into this offensive. His last fuel reserves, his best remaining units, even disguised English-speaking commandos in stolen American uniforms. The initial shock sent American units reeling. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered almost entirely intact, the largest mass surrender of US troops since Bataan. But at crucial moments, individual Americans proved unbreakable. In Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, General Anthony McAuliffe responded to German surrender demands with one word: nuts. In Saint. Vith, Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, held out for 6 crucial days. At Lanzerath Ridge, an 18-man intelligence platoon fought 1,000 German paratroopers for an entire day. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd. Allied air power returned with a vengeance. C-47S dropped supplies to surrounded troops. P-47 Thunderbolts hammered German columns. Patton's Third Army, executing a remarkable 90-degree turn in winter conditions, smashed into the German flank. By January, the Bulge had been eliminated, but at terrible cost. Nearly 20,000 Americans died. The Wehrmacht had spent its last reserves. Yet Hitler, sealed in his Berlin bunker, planned still more offensives. Reality had no place in his world. The Eastern Front witnessed an even greater cataclysm. The Soviet January offensive employed 225 divisions, twice the number that invaded Normandy. The Red Army advanced 40 kilometers per day, crushing German Army Group Center. East Prussia, German territory since the medieval Teutonic Knights, fell to Soviet tanks. Civilians paid the heaviest price. As the Red Army advanced, millions of Germans fled westward in the bitter winter of 1945. The refugee column stretched for miles. Women pulled children on sleds. Old men froze to death in ditches. Behind them came the sound of gunfire as Soviet troops, driven by years of Nazi atrocities, took their revenge. Berlin became a city of women, children, and old men. Hitler Youth members as young as 14 manned anti-aircraft guns. The Nazi leadership split into three camps: fanatics determined to fight to the end, realists seeking to surrender to Western allies, and those simply trying to survive. SS men hanged defeatists from lampposts, even as Soviet artillery grew louder. The final battle for Berlin defied description. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov employed more artillery pieces than Germany had rifles. The bombardment shattered the city's sanity. In the ruins, old men from the Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch militia, faced Soviet tanks with obsolete Panzerfausts. Children fought in the subway tunnels. Women committed suicide rather than face the advancing Red Army. Hitler spent his last days in the Führerbunker, moving imaginary armies on maps, ranting against betrayal. On April 30th, with Soviet troops 2 blocks away, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun. Hours later, they committed suicide. Nazi propaganda had promised Germans either victory or destruction. Hitler delivered the latter. The end came with tragic farce. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, tried to play the Western Allies against the Soviets. It was too late. German units raced west, desperate to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. General Walter Wenk's 12th Army, ordered to rescue Berlin, instead protected civilian refugees fleeing west. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France. The next day, Marshal Wilhelm Keitel repeated the ceremony in Berlin for the Soviets. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and 3 months. The human toll defied comprehension. 40 million Europeans dead. Germany's cities pulverized. Eastern Europe transformed into a wasteland. The Holocaust's full horror emerged as Allied troops liberated the death camps. An entire civilization had immolated itself. Yet even as Europe lay in ruins, new tensions emerged. The United States and Soviet Union, allies of necessity, eyed each other warily across occupied Germany. Churchill already warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The peace would prove almost as complex as the war. But first, another enemy remained. In the Pacific, Japan fought on, seemingly oblivious to Germany's fate. Its defeat would require a new weapon, one that would change warfare for the end of World War II and Japan's transformation. The road to Tokyo ran through hell. Each Pacific island became its own war, each battle more savage than the last. At Iwo Jima, US Marines faced an enemy they couldn't see. 20,000 Japanese soldiers buried in volcanic rock, waiting in tunnels and caves. The island's black sand beaches turned red. Uncommon valor was a common virtue, Admiral Chester Nimitz would say of the Marines who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. Okinawa proved even worse. The 82-day battle consumed more American lives than D-Day. Japanese defenders transformed the island into a fortress, fighting from caves that had taken years to prepare. Kamikaze pilots, their name meaning divine wind, crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The US Navy suffered its worst losses of the war. But the human horror lay in Okinawa's civilian population. Convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans would torture them, thousands jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. Entire families died together. American soldiers, hardened by years of combat, broke down trying to stop the suicides. Japan itself faced systematic destruction from the air. B-29 superfortresses, each carrying more payload than an entire World War I bombing raid, struck Japanese cities nightly. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more civilians than either atomic bomb. Yet Japan fought on. Emperor Hirohito's cabinet still debated whether to arm women and children with bamboo spears for the final battle. The Manhattan Project provided a terrible alternative. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, scientists witnessed the first atomic explosion. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, recalled a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The weapon they had created would reshape human civilization. President Harry Truman faced an impossible choice. Invasion plans for Japan, Operation Downfall, predicted up to 1 million American casualties and even more Japanese deaths. The atomic bomb might end the war immediately, or open a Pandora's box humanity could never close. Truman, who had never heard of the Manhattan Project before becoming president, had to decide. August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay, a specially modified B-29, approached Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy, a uranium weapon never tested before, fell toward the city. 43 seconds later, physics transformed into apocalypse. The blast vaporized 70,000 people instantly. Many left only shadows on walls. Still, Japan's military leaders resisted surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, destroyed Nagasaki. Even then, hardliners attempted a palace coup to prevent surrender. They failed. On August 15th, Japanese radio broadcast the unthinkable, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. The formal surrender on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, marked more than Japan's defeat. It ended the Age of Empire. Japan's surrender freed not just occupied Asia, but sparked independence movements across European colonies. The world map would never be the same. The human cost of Japan's defeat staggered imagination. 2 atomic bombs. 67 Japanese cities burned. 2 million Japanese dead. Tens of millions of Asian civilians killed during the occupation. Entire cultures, like the Okinawan, forever altered. Yet from the ashes came transformation. Under American occupation, Japan embraced democracy, renounced war, and rebuilt its economy. Emperor Hirohito, once worshipped as a god, became a constitutional monarch interested in marine biology. Former enemies became crucial Cold War allies. But the atomic genie could never be rebottled. The world entered a new age where humanity possessed the power to destroy itself. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki cast shadows that still darken our dreams. World War II was over. Civilization had survived its greatest trial. But the world that emerged would face new challenges, new divisions, and the constant knowledge that next time there might not be anything left to rebuild. The cost of World War II, human and material toll. History's ledger groaned under the weight of World War II's cost. Behind every statistic lay a human story. A Soviet woman searching burned ruins for her family's remains. A Polish child who would never know his parents' faces. A Japanese girl with keloid scars where atomic flashburns had seared her skin. The numbers numbed the mind. 70 million dead globally, more than the entire population of Britain at the time. China lost 15 million to Japanese occupation. Poland saw a third of its citizens vanish. The Soviet Union sacrificed an entire generation, 27 million souls. More French civilians died than soldiers. Greece lost a higher percentage of its Jewish population than any other occupied nation. Cities vanished from the map. Warsaw, 85% destroyed. Manila, flattened in the crossfire between Japanese defenders and American liberators. Hamburg, transformed into a firestorm that created its own weather. Berlin, reduced to 75 million cubic meters of rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, altered at the atomic level. The landscape itself changed. French farmers still die today from unexploded WWI shells. Their grandchildren will face WW2 bombs. Pacific Islands, blasted into coral dust, would never recover their ecology. The Soviet Union lost 40% of its railways, 60% of its roads, and a generation's worth of housing. 6 million European buildings lay in ruins. But physical destruction told only part of the story. The Holocaust created wounds that could never heal. Entire communities, Jewish, Roma, Sinti, disappeared from regions they had inhabited for centuries. The ancient Yiddish-speaking culture of Eastern Europe vanished into mass graves. Survivors carried numbers tattooed on their arms and memories that would haunt their dreams forever. Displacement reached biblical proportions. 12 million Germans fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. Poland shifted bodily westward, losing territory to the Soviet Union and gaining it from Germany. Historic communities in East Prussia, Silesia, and the Sudetenland, German for centuries, vanished overnight. Cities like Königsberg became Kaliningrad, their entire populations replaced. The psychological toll defied measurement. Shell shock from World War I became combat fatigue in World War II, but new names couldn't mask old horrors. Teenage bomber crews aged decades in months. Infantry veterans jumped at car backfires for the rest of their lives. Civilians who survived bombings never again slept soundly through thunderstorms. Children bore special scars. British evacuees sent to the countryside for safety lost years with their families. German children raised on Nazi ideology had to reimagine their entire world. Japanese school children who had been drilling with bamboo spears now attended democracy classes taught by American occupiers. A generation grew up knowing only war, rationing, and fear. Women's roles changed permanently. Rosie the Riveter didn't go quietly back to the kitchen. Soviet women who had served as snipers and pilots refused to surrender their new independence. Japanese women, granted voting rights by occupation authorities, embraced democracy with unexpected enthusiasm. The home front had permanently altered the home. Science made terrifying leaps. Atomic physics, radar, jet engines, computers, technologies that would define the post-war world emerged from military necessity. German V-2 rockets, assembled by slave labor, pioneered spaceflight. Penicillin, mass-produced for military medicine, transformed civilian healthcare. The first electronic computer, ENIAC, calculated artillery tables. The economic map redrew itself. Britain, though victorious, lost its empire and went bankrupt. The United States emerged as the world's creditor and arsenal. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, became a superpower. Germany and Japan, utterly defeated, would rise again as economic powerhouses, but only after accepting democracy at gunpoint. Yet amid the devastation, hope sprouted like flowers in bomb craters. The United Nations rose from the League of Nations' ashes. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged from Holocaust awareness. European integration began as a way to prevent future wars. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund promised economic stability. The final cost. Beyond calculation, the world that emerged from World War II's crucible was poorer in lives, but richer in possibilities, devastated yet determined, haunted by the past, but focused on the future. The question was, could humanity learn from its most expensive lesson? The answer would define the next century. The legacy of World War II. Victory split the world along a new fault line. In 1945, American and Soviet soldiers embraced at the Elbe River. By 1946, Winston Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The wartime alliance shattered into a Cold War that would dominate the next half-century. Berlin embodied the new reality. The city that had commanded Hitler's legions now lay divided between East and West, a concrete and barbed wire symbol of Europe's partition. American and Soviet tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie, their engines idling, their guns loaded. The front line of World War III ran through cafes and subway stations. The colonial empires unraveled with stunning speed. Britain's finest hour had bankrupted its empire. India gained independence in 1947, splitting into two nations amid religious violence that killed millions. French Indochina erupted into guerrilla war. The Netherlands lost Indonesia. Belgium retreated from the Congo. Within 2 decades, the imperial powers that had dominated the globe for centuries withdrew to Europe. Japan transformed itself with extraordinary discipline. Emperor Hirohito, once a living god, became a constitutional monarch interested in marine biology. Former wartime industrialists rebuilt their zaibatsu conglomerates into world-beating corporations like Sony and Toyota. A nation that had tried to conquer Asia with tanks now did it with transistor radios and compact cars. Germany's division mirrored the global split. West Germany embraced democracy and free markets, becoming Europe's economic powerhouse. East Germany built the Berlin Wall to keep its citizens from fleeing to the West. A nation that had tried to unite Europe by force now had to watch its own people divided by superpower politics. The United Nations emerged as humanity's best hope and greatest frustration. Its blue-helmeted peacekeepers won Nobel Prizes while failing to prevent genocides. The Security Council, designed to prevent another world war, became a theater for Cold War vetoes. Yet the UN's very existence marked progress. Nations now fought with words instead of weapons. Technology born from war reshaped peace. German V-2 rockets evolved into the space race. Radar became air traffic control. Nuclear physics powered cities and submarines. The first electronic computer, ENIAC, pointed toward a digital revolution. Even the internet began as a Pentagon project to survive nuclear war. Cultural aftershocks reverberated for decades. World War II movies became their own genre. Every nation crafted its own narrative. American triumphalism, Soviet sacrifice, British endurance, German redemption, Japanese reconstruction. Holocaust memorials reminded humanity of its capacity for organized evil. The greatest generation carried invisible scars. Combat veterans jumped at sudden noises for life. Concentration camp survivors never again wasted bread. London children who survived the Blitz developed lifelong claustrophobia in subway stations. Japanese Americans fought prejudice decades after leaving internment camps. New international institutions rewrote global rules. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund managed the world's money. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later World Trade Organization, promoted commerce over conflict. NATO and the Warsaw Pact divided Europe into armed camps but prevented direct confrontation. European integration began as a way to prevent future wars. France and Germany, hereditary enemies, bound their coal and steel industries together so tightly that conflict became impossible. The European Union grew from this seed, expanding until it encompassed most of the continent that had tried to destroy itself twice in 30 years. Jewish history pivoted on the Holocaust's hinge. Israel's founding in 1948 fulfilled ancient dreams while creating new conflicts. German reparations helped build the Jewish state while acknowledging debts that could never be fully repaid. The warning "never again" became both prayer and policy. The atomic shadow lengthened. The Soviet Union tested its own bomb in 1949. The hydrogen bomb raised the stakes. Nuclear strategy became a deadly game theory exercise. MAD, mutually assured destruction, kept peace through the threat of planetary suicide. Humanity learned to live with the knowledge it could destroy itself. Memory became a battlefield itself. Japan debated its textbook's treatment of the war. Germans confronted their Nazi past with memorial and museums. Russians celebrated their great patriotic war while others remembered Soviet occupation. Each nation struggled to reconcile pride and shame, heroism and atrocity. World War II's greatest legacy may be what didn't happen, World War III. Nations that had fought to the death in 1945 became allies by 1955. Germany and Japan turned militant nationalism into economic productivity. The Cold War stayed cold. Humanity learned to live with apocalyptic weapons by choosing not to use them. The war that ended in 1945 shaped the world we inherit today. Its alliances, institutions, and fears still guide international relations. Its lessons about totalitarianism, genocide, and human resilience remain urgently relevant. The future may not repeat the past, but it must never forget